She walked 10 miles through a blizzard with a baby in her arms and bruises she never explained. He hadn't opened that door to anyone in 8 years. When he finally did, standing there in the howling dark, lantern in hand, snow cutting sideways across the mountain, what he found on his porch wasn't just a woman on the edge of dying. It was the beginning of the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him. Not the storm, not the armed men who would come later. The dangerous thing was that he let her in. If you're watching this, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The wind came down off the mountain like something that had a grudge. Silas Boone had lived at the edge of the Cowboy Range long enough to know the difference between a regular winter storm and the kind that wanted to kill you. This one, rolling in from the northwest just after sundown on the 14th of January, was the second kind. He'd watched it build all afternoon from the porch, that particular shade of gray-green pressing against the peaks. And by the time he got the horses into the barn and the barn doors latched, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in under an hour. He was 41 years old. He had lived alone on this ranch for 8 of those years. He knew how to read the sky the way other men read a newspaper, quickly, without sentiment, just looking for information that might keep him alive. Tonight, the sky said, "Stay inside and don't open the door for anything." He made coffee. He stoked the wood stove in the front room until the iron sides ticked with heat. He sat in the same chair he always sat in, the one by the window that faced east, the one that his wife Eleanor had picked out from a catalog the first winter they were married, the one he'd never been able to get rid of even after everything. And he opened a book he'd already read twice and tried to concentrate on the words. The wind screamed against the shutters. The fire popped. Silas turned a page without reading it. He was good at this, the sitting, the enduring. 8 years of practice had made him competent at filling up the hours of an evening without thinking too hard about what the evening used to feel like when there was someone else in the house. He'd gotten so good at it, in fact, that some part of him had stopped noticing there was anything wrong with it at all. The quiet had become the furniture. The absence had become the walls. He was on his 3rd cup of coffee and considering just going to bed when he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind doing something strange, catching the corner of the house at a particular angle, making a sound that almost resembled knocking. It happened sometimes. The Cowboy Range had its own acoustics, and storms up here could produce noises that would make a less experienced man reach for his rifle. Silas put down his coffee and listened. Silence. Wind. Snow against glass. He picked up his coffee again. And then, unmistakable this time, no possibility of misreading it, 3 hard knocks against the front door. Desperate. Close together. The knock of someone who wasn't sure they had the strength for a 4th. Silas was on his feet before he'd made a conscious decision to move. He grabbed the lantern off the table and the rifle that leaned against the wall beside the door, not pointing it at anything, just having it. And he lifted the latch and pulled the door open against the wind, which immediately tried to rip it out of his hand. The cold hit him like a physical blow. And there on his porch, swaying, barely standing, was a young woman he had never seen before in his life. She was maybe 25, dark hair plastered to her face and neck, soaked through and beginning to ice at the ends. A coat that was wholly inadequate for this weather. He could see that at a glance, could see it was the kind of coat you wore in town, not the kind you wore on a mountain in January. Her lips were the wrong color. Her hands, one clutching the porch rail, the other pressed flat against her chest, were shaking so badly he could see it from 3 feet away. Pressed against her chest, bundled inside the coat with her, he could see the round, blanketed shape of a baby. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind filled the silence with everything it had. Then the woman looked up at him with eyes so exhausted they'd gone somewhere past fear, and she said, in a voice that came out ragged and raw, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I need work. I can cook. I can clean. I'll sleep in the barn if you need me to." She stopped, swallowed. Her jaw was shaking. "Please, I just need somewhere to be tonight." Silas stood there in the open doorway with the lantern and the rifle and 8 years of solitude at his back. Later, he would not be able to fully explain what he did next, or why. "Get inside," he said. Her name was Mara Quinn, and that was almost all she told him that first night. He got her through the door and pushed it shut against the wind and stood there for a moment just looking at her while she stood dripping on the entry rug, too exhausted to even be embarrassed about the puddle forming at her feet. She was holding the baby with both arms now, pressing him against her chest with the ferociousness of someone who had been doing that for a very long time and wasn't going to stop. "Is he all right?" Silas asked, nodding at the bundle. Mara looked down, as though checking something she already knew but needed to confirm anyway. She pulled back the edge of the blanket and Silas caught a glimpse of a small face, pink, scrunched, blissfully unaware of anything. And the baby made a sound that was half yawn and half protest at the disturbance of air temperature. "He's fine," she said. Her voice cracked on the second word. "He stayed warm. I made sure he stayed warm." There was something in how she said it, the flatness of it, the absolute refusal of it to be anything other than a fact. That told Silas she had probably said it to herself approximately 10,000 times over the last several hours. "Sit down," he said. "I'll get blankets." "I don't need to—" "Sit down," he said again, not unkindly. "I'm not going to argue with you about it." She sat. He brought blankets from the cedar chest in the bedroom. The good ones, the heavy wool ones that had been folded in there since Eleanor picked them out. And he brought them to Mara without thinking about where they'd come from, without letting himself think about it. He put the largest one around her shoulders, and she pulled it tight with her free hand, and then she just sat there in front of the stove with the baby and the blanket, and her eyes half closed. And Silas went back to the kitchen and made more coffee and didn't ask any questions. Not yet. He scrambled eggs. He had bread that was 2 days old but still good, and he sliced it thick and put butter on it, and he brought all of it out to the front room on a plate and set it on the small table beside the chair she'd taken. She looked at the food and then up at him, and something moved across her face that he couldn't quite name. She ate fast. Not inhaling it, she had manners, he could tell. She'd been raised knowing not to shovel food, but quickly. Efficiently. The way a person eats when they haven't had anything for longer than they're going to admit. The baby slept through all of it, tucked into the armchair cushion beside her. When she was done, she set the fork down and straightened her back like she was preparing for something unpleasant. "I can pay you," she said. "Not much right now, but I will. I can cook. I know how to keep a house, do laundry, mend things. I don't take up much space." She paused. "I just need maybe a week to figure out the next part." Silas was leaning against the doorframe between the front room and the kitchen, watching her. He was a tall man, and the house had been built by a shorter one, so he had the habit of leaning in doorways. "Where'd you walk from?" he asked. She hesitated. "Millard Creek," she said finally. He kept his face still, but the number landed in him like a stone dropping into water. Millard Creek was 10 miles south. 10 miles on the main road in good weather was a 2-hour walk. In the storm that was currently trying to tear his roof off, it was a miracle. "You walked 10 miles, he said, "in this storm, with a baby." "Yes." "Why didn't you take the stage road? There's a station at—" "I know where the station is." Something shifted in her expression, just briefly. "I couldn't use the station." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "1 week. You can have the small room at the back. It's got a wood stove. I'll light it." She blinked. "Just like that?" "You walked 10 miles through a blizzard carrying a baby," he said. "I figure that's reference enough." The small room had been used for storage for the better part of 5 years. Silas spent an hour clearing it out, moving boxes of old harness equipment, a broken rocking chair, 3 years of farm records he kept meaning to organize, while Mara fed the baby in the front room. He lit the small iron stove and waited until the room was genuinely warm before he called her in. He'd found a narrow bed frame in the storage area of the barn during his first summer alone and had dragged it inside thinking he might need it for a ranch hand someday. He'd never hired one. The mattress was thin but clean, and he brought 2 more of the wool blankets and stacked them at the foot. He stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at it and tried to see it the way someone else might. It was not much. The walls were bare boards. There was a single window with frost already patterning the inside of the glass. The floor needed sweeping, but it was warm, and it was out of the wind, and he had a feeling he couldn't have explained and wouldn't have tried to, that right now, for this particular woman, warm and out of the wind was everything. "It'll do," Mara said quietly, from behind him. He moved aside to let her in. She walked into the room and stood in the center of it, still holding the baby against her chest, and she just looked around at the bare walls and the thin mattress and the frost on the glass, and she let out a breath so long and so slow that it seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than her lungs. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "You're working for it." He said goodnight and closed the door and went back to the front room, which was now somehow both warmer and emptier than it had been an hour ago. He stood by the wood stove and drank the last of his coffee and listened to the storm work itself against the house. He didn't go to sleep for a long time. Her name was Mara Quinn, and in the morning she made breakfast before he was even up. Silas came out of his bedroom at 6, which was later than usual. He'd slept poorly, the way you slept in a house that had changed while you weren't watching. And he stopped in the doorway to the kitchen and stood there for a moment, just absorbing what he was looking at. The baby, she'd told him the night before his name was Eli, 6 months old, was sitting propped in the corner of the kitchen bench with a rolled blanket on either side of him to keep him upright. And he was watching everything with the wide-eyed seriousness of someone attending a very important lecture. Mara was at the stove with her back to Silas, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years cooking in a kitchen that wasn't quite big enough. There were eggs on the griddle. There was something that smelled like, he tilted his head, cornmeal porridge? He hadn't had cornmeal porridge since he was a boy. "There's coffee," Mara said without turning around. "Pot's on the back." "How'd you know I was there?" "Your boot's on the floor." He poured his coffee and sat at the table across from Eli, and the baby fixed him with a look of deep and solemn evaluation. Silas wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with that, so he drank his coffee and looked back. Mara set the plate down in front of him without ceremony. Eggs, pan biscuits, he hadn't even seen her make, a small bowl of the cornmeal porridge, and she turned back to the stove and started washing the pan before he'd taken a single bite. "You're going to eat something," he said. "I ate already." "You made this whole breakfast and ate what, exactly?" A pause. "The end of the bread." "Mara." She turned slightly. Her profile was sharp in the morning light. Cheekbones, the line of her jaw, the particular set of her mouth that suggested she was constitutionally opposed to accepting help. He could also see, now that he was looking at her in daylight for the first time, the yellowing edge of a bruise along the left side of her jaw that she'd done a reasonable job of keeping angled away from him. He pretended he hadn't seen it. "Sit down and eat something proper," he said. "I've got enough food. You're no use to me if you're falling over." She stood there for a moment with the clean pan in her hand, and he could see her working out whether this was a fight worth having. Then she put the pan on the shelf and came to the table and sat across from him and took half the eggs for herself without looking at him. Eli between them made a sound that might have been commentary. "He's a funny little thing," Silas said. Mara glanced at her son with an expression that she probably didn't realize was pure, unguarded love. "He's been serious since the day he was born," she said. "Came out looking like he had opinions. He's looking at me like I failed an inspection." The corner of Mara's mouth moved, almost a smile. "You passed," she said. "He'd have cried by now if you hadn't." They ate in silence for a little while, which was strange because silence in that kitchen for the past several years had been complete and unbroken, and now there was the sound of Eli occasionally commenting on the proceedings and the sound of 2 sets of silverware, and somehow those small additions made the room feel like a different room entirely. Silas ate his breakfast and didn't ask about the bruise. Not yet. He gave her the run of the house and the kitchen, and he went about his work, which in January on a mountain ranch meant mostly maintenance. Checking and reinforcing fences where the snow had collapsed them, hauling feed to the cattle in the lower pasture, breaking the ice on the water troughs twice a day, mending equipment in the barn when it was too cold to do much else outside. He was gone from the house most of the day. Every time he came back, something had changed. The first day, she'd scrubbed the kitchen floor. He hadn't realized how bad it was until he walked in and saw it clean. The second day, she'd organized the dry goods in the pantry, everything grouped and labeled with pieces of torn paper and a stub of pencil she must have found in a drawer, and she'd mended a tear in the curtain over the front window that had been there so long he'd stopped seeing it. The third day, she'd found his collection of cracked harness straps in the barn and resoled them with a strip of leather from a busted pair of his old boots, stitching them so neatly he had to look twice to find where the repair was. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he asked, holding up the harness. "My father had horses," she said. She was nursing Eli in the chair by the front window, not looking up. He said knowing how to fix equipment was more important than knowing how to buy it. Smart man. He was. Past tense, flat, no invitation to follow up on it. Silas put the harness down and went back out to the barn. He spent a lot of time that first week trying not to notice things about her, trying not to notice that she moved through his house with a carefulness that was different from tidiness, more like the carefulness of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible, as if making herself small were a skill she'd practiced to the point of habit. Trying not to notice that she sat with Eli, so her back was always to a wall and her eyes to the door. Trying not to notice that some mornings she came to breakfast with a look around her eyes that wasn't sleeplessness exactly, but wasn't not sleeplessness either. He tried not to notice the bruise, which faded through yellow and then green, and then was almost gone by Friday. He noticed all of it anyway. Thursday evening, after supper, they sat in the front room because the fire was good and it had started snowing again outside, and Silas was mending a split in his heavy work gloves while Mara read to Eli from a small book she'd apparently been carrying in her coat. He could see it was well worn, the spine repaired twice with strips of cloth. Eli was not old enough to understand words, obviously, but he lay on the blanket at Mara's feet and tracked the sound of her voice with the same grave attention he gave everything. It was quietly pleasant in a way that Silas found mildly alarming. "What's the book?" he asked. She looked up. "Old folk stories? My mother gave it to me." She turned it over in her hands. "I want him to know them, even if he doesn't understand yet." "That how you think it works? Starting early?" "I think," she said carefully, "that some things get into you before you know you're learning them. Like weather, like landscape." She paused. "Like fear." Something in how she said the last word made Silas set down the gloves. "Mara," he said. "Don't," she said, before he could get any further. "I'm not asking you to tell me everything. You're asking. I'm asking if you're all right." She was quiet for a long moment. Eli reached up and grabbed her finger where it rested near him on the blanket, and she let him hold it. "No," she said finally. "Not really, but I'm working on it." She looked up at him. "I'm not going to bring trouble to your house. I want you to know that." Silas picked his gloves back up. "Already told you. 1 week. Cook and clean, you said. You've done that and then some. Question of trouble is a different conversation." She watched him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read. "You're a strange man," she said. "Most men would have had more questions by now." "I've got plenty of questions," he said. "I just figured you'd tell me what I needed to know when you were ready." She seemed to think about that for a moment. "The week's up Saturday," she said. "Yes." "I could stay another week," she said, and it came out less like an offer and more like a question she was nervous to have answered. "If you still needed the cooking done, I haven't started on the—" "You can stay," he said, not looking up from the gloves. "The place looks better than it has in years. Eli doesn't bother me." He paused. "You don't bother me." Mara Quinn sat in his wife's old chair with her son holding her finger, and outside the snow came down sideways across the dark mountain, and she didn't say thank you, and he was glad she didn't. "All right then," she said quietly. Eli made a small sound that was probably just gas, but sounded remarkably like agreement. Saturday morning, Silas was in the barn breaking ice off the water trough when he heard the horses on the road. He heard them before he saw them. 3 sets of hooves, moving at a deliberate pace, not the hurry of someone who had an emergency or the loose walk of someone just passing through. Deliberate. Like men who knew where they were going and weren't in any particular rush because they were confident they'd get there. He came out of the barn with the ice break still in his hand and stood in the yard. There were 2 of them visible on the road. The third had pulled off to the side, partially behind a stand of pine trees, in a position that was technically casual, but was also technically a good position from which to watch a yard and a door. Silas noted that without reacting to it. The 2 riders on the road pulled up at the fence line, and the one in front looked down at Silas with a face that had the particular quality of someone who'd spent a lot of time looking at people from horseback and knew what it did. He was maybe 50, with a gray-streaked beard trimmed close and a buffalo coat that cost more than most men's saddles. The hat was expensive, too. He had the look of a man who was used to being believed. "Morning," the man said pleasantly. "Cold one." "It is," Silas said. You'd be Boone? Silas Boone? Own this spread? That's right. Name's Mercer, Clyde Mercer. He said it like it should mean something. I'm employed by a man trying to locate his family, young wife and a baby boy. Wife's name is Mara. A pause. A careful pause. Goes by Quinn. Silas held the icebreak at his side. He looked at Mercer and then at the second rider, and then at the shape of the third one back behind the pines. And he breathed slowly in the cold air and thought about a woman who'd walked 10 miles in a blizzard and hadn't told him why. Haven't seen anyone like that, he said. Mercer smiled, but it didn't reach anything. We've been talking to folks along this road. Word is she was seen heading this direction, night of the big storm. A lot of people would be heading this direction in a storm, Silas said. It's the only road. That's true. That's very true. Mercer reached into his coat and produced a folded paper and leaned down from the saddle to hold it out. There's a reward for information. Good one. Husband's worried sick. Silas didn't take the paper. I haven't seen anyone like that, he said again. Mercer's smile stayed where it was. Well, you think of anything, you let us know. We'll be in the area. He pulled his horse around, unhurried. Nice spread, Mr. Boone. Be ashamed to have trouble at a nice spread like this. He said it pleasantly, easily, the way men like him said threats when they didn't need to say them out loud yet. The three riders went back down the road the way they'd come, and Silas stood in his yard in the cold and watched them go and did not move until they were completely out of sight. Then he turned and walked back to the house. Mara was at the kitchen table when he came in. She'd heard. He could tell she'd heard from the moment he stepped through the door and looked at her face. The color had gone out of it, her hands were flat on the tabletop, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who'd been bracing for something and had finally felt it land. Eli was in the small basket on the kitchen floor, asleep. Silas pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Clyde Mercer, he said, 3 riders. Says he's looking for a woman named Mara Quinn on behalf of her husband. Her jaw was tight. I know who Mercer is. Is there a husband? The silence lasted 3 seconds. 4. Yes, she said. Is he the one who put that bruise on your jaw? The silence lasted longer this time. She looked at the table, then at Eli in the basket, then at the window. Yes, she said. Silas folded his hands on the table in front of him. He was not a man who did a lot of things quickly. He'd found that a lifetime of ranch work had given him a fundamental preference for deliberate movement, and so he sat there for a moment and let her have the silence, and then he said, All right, here's what I know. 3 armed men just rode up to my property claiming to be looking for you. One of them told me it'd be a shame if I had trouble at a nice spread. He paused. So I know there's a problem. I don't know the whole problem yet, and I think I need to. Mara pressed her lips together. He watched her try to figure out how little she could say and still be fair to him. It's not simple, she said. I didn't figure it was. If I tell you, if you know, you're part of it. He won't see any difference between helping me and being my enemy. Silas looked at her steadily. I already lied to his men, he said. I think that ship has sailed. Something in her face shifted. She looked at him for a long moment, and he had the sense she was measuring something. Not him exactly, but something about the situation, some calculation she'd been running since the moment she sat down. His name is Victor Quinn, she said. He's my husband, and he's not the man Mercer told you he is. Tell me what he is. Mara looked at her hands. She took a breath, and she started talking. She'd met Victor Quinn when she was 19 and working in her uncle's dry goods store in the town of Seaton, 2 counties east. He was 28, charming in the way that some men were charming when they needed something, and what he needed was a wife who wouldn't ask too many questions. She didn't know that then. She thought she'd found something good. He was different at first, she said, or I thought he was. Maybe he was just being careful. She said it without bitterness, just the flat acknowledgement of something she'd had a long time to think about. He had land. He had a plan for it. He made things sound like they were going somewhere. The first 2 years were hard, but not obviously wrong. Victor was demanding, critical, had a temper. But lots of men had tempers, and she'd grown up around men who shouted when they were frustrated, and she figured she could manage it. She figured a lot of things. The 3rd year, she got pregnant. That's when things started to change, she said. Or that's when I stopped being able to pretend they hadn't already changed. Victor had money problems she hadn't known about. Big ones. He'd borrowed against the land, borrowed from men who weren't exactly patient about repayment, and the ranch he'd convinced her was solid was mortgaged so deeply there was nothing left of it. He'd known this when they married. He'd never told her. When I found out, she said, he hit me for the first time. She said it simply, without drama. The way you said a thing you'd had to say enough times that it had lost the power to hurt in the saying. After Eli was born, I knew I had to leave. I started saving, money from the food budget, little amounts, things he wouldn't notice. It took 8 months. And then, Silas said, and then Victor did something I didn't expect. She looked up. Her eyes were steady and dark and completely serious. He faked his own death. The kitchen was very quiet. He what? He burned down the house, she said, made it look like an accident, left enough behind for people to think he died in it. He owed money to the kind of men who didn't just take the land back. They took you, so he ran. She paused. He expected me to wait. Wait for what? For him to come back when he'd figured out the next plan. When he'd set something up somewhere new. He expected me to be there when he was ready for me again. Something moved across her face. Not anger, not quite. Something older than anger. He didn't think of us as people he was leaving. He thought of us as things he was storing. Silas sat with that for a moment. So you ran, he said. I ran, she said, as soon as I understood what he'd done. Because I knew if I waited, if I let him find me on his terms, he'd just move us somewhere new and start over, and Eli would grow up in that. Eli would grow up thinking that was how things were. Her voice didn't break. It came very close, but it didn't. I took the money I'd saved and I walked out, she said. That was 3 weeks ago. I've been moving since. On foot? Mostly. She paused. I had a horse for the first week. Had to sell it for food. Silas was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, a low and constant sound like breathing. Mercer is Victor's man, he said finally. Mercer finds people, she said. That's all he does. Victor pays him well, and he's very good at it. How close was he? Close enough that I came here instead of the stage station. She looked at him directly. I knew if I went somewhere with other people, someone would see me. Someone would talk. She glanced at the window. I came up the mountain instead. I thought if I could just get past the storm, get somewhere to rest for a day or two, I could figure out what to do next. What were you going to do next? I don't know, she said, and for the first time since she'd started talking, he heard something that was close to lost in her voice. I've been so busy staying ahead of him that I haven't had time to think about what ahead of him actually looks like. Silas stood up. He went to the window and stood there looking out at the mountain road. Empty now, just 2 lines of churned snow where the horses had been. He stood there for a while. Then he turned around. You can stay, he said. Not for a week, not for 2. You can stay until we figure this out properly. Mara stared at him. Silas, Mercer's already been to my door, he said. That makes it my problem too, whether I want it to be or not. And I've got a lawyer friend down in Harlan, a man named Nathan Crowley. He's a good man. I want to write to him. A lawyer can't stop Victor. Not immediately, but legally. If you left because of abuse, if there's testimony, Victor is very good at looking like a victim, she said flatly. He's been doing it his whole life. Maybe, Silas said. But he's also a man who faked his own death and committed fraud and owes money to dangerous people. That's not nothing. She was watching him with an expression that was complicated. Something between gratitude and the specific caution of someone who'd trusted the wrong person before and was still carrying the weight of it. Why are you doing this? She said. Not accusing, genuinely asking. Silas considered the question. Because you walked 10 miles in a blizzard carrying a baby, he said. And because Mercer threatened my ranch, and because... He stopped. Looked for the honest version of it. Because whatever this place was before you showed up, it was only about half alive. And that's not reason enough by itself. But it's part of it. Mara Quinn looked at him for a long time across the kitchen table. All right, she said quietly. All right. Eli stirred in his basket, and they both looked at him. The small, serious face, the tiny fist uncurling against the air. And for a moment the kitchen was just a kitchen, and the storm outside was just weather, and the two of them were just two people sitting with a baby between them. The moment didn't last, but it had been there. That night, Silas sat down and wrote a long letter to Nathan Crowley in Harlan. He wrote everything Mara had told him, carefully and exactly, and he asked Nathan what legal remedies existed for a woman whose husband had committed fraud, faked his death, and was now pursuing her across the territory with hired trackers. He sealed the letter and left it on the table to go out with the next rider who passed headed south. Then he went to the barn and checked the horses and checked the door latches and stood for a while in the cold, dark barn, listening to the sounds the mountain made at night. The wind, the pine trees, the occasional creak of the old wood settling. He thought about Eleanor. He did that sometimes, still. Not with the raw grief of the first years, but with the specific ache of something that had happened and couldn't unhappen, and that had changed the shape of everything that came after it. Eleanor had died in a winter storm. Not this winter and not this storm, but winter enough and storm enough. She'd been 7 months along with their first child, and she'd been going to fetch the midwife because the pains had started early, and he'd been in the back 40 because he hadn't known, and by the time he came in it was too late for any of it. He had not spoken of it to anyone in 8 years. He thought about it now, standing in the barn in the dark, because he wanted to be honest with himself about what he was doing. He was letting a woman and her baby stay on his ranch, and he was preparing to get into a fight with dangerous men on her behalf. And he wanted to be sure, and he needed to be sure, that what he was doing was for her and not for some ghost he was trying to put to rest. He stood there for a long time, being honest with himself. When he came back inside, Mara's door was dark and quiet. He could hear Eli making small sleeping sounds through the wood. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in a long time. The week that followed was ordinary in the way that things were sometimes ordinary when something large was waiting in the background for the right moment to arrive. Silas went about his work. Mara went about hers. The meals got better as she learned which shelves held what and which quirks the old stove had. It ran hot on the left, had to be compensated for, and she figured that out by the third day, and after that there was nothing she made that came out wrong. He started finding himself looking forward to coming in from the cold. That was new, or it was old, and he'd forgotten what new felt like. Eli watched everything with his perpetual air of evaluation and occasionally grabbed things he shouldn't have and was redirected with a patience that Silas found quietly impressive. "He's got a grip like a fence staple," Silas said one evening, retrieving his work glove from Eli's fist. "He grabbed my hair for 20 minutes this morning," Mara said, not looking up from the stove. "I considered just leaving it with him." "Did he look satisfied after?" "Extremely." Silas looked at the baby, who looked back at him with a gravity that suggested the glove had been a legitimate interest and should not be dismissed. He laughed. It came out a little rusty. It had been a while, but it was real, and Mara glanced over at him with an expression that was surprised. And then something else. Something he filed away and didn't examine too carefully. Nathan Crowley's reply came 8 days after Silas sent the letter. He read it alone at the kitchen table in the morning before Mara was up, and then he read it again. Nathan wrote clearly and without softening things, which was what Silas had always liked about him. The legal situation was complicated. Victor Quinn's faked death muddied the water considerably. If there was no death certificate, the legal status of the marriage was ambiguous, but that ambiguity cut both ways. If Victor had abandoned her, she had grounds. If Victor claimed she'd left voluntarily, he had recourse. The question of custody would depend heavily on testimony and on the specific judge. "Get what documentation you can," Nathan had written. "Any proof of the abuse, any proof of the debts, and the fraud. If she has witnesses, find them, and bring her to Harlan when you're ready. I'll prepare the filings. But Silas, I want to be clear. If this man has the money and inclination to fight it, this will not be quick or pleasant." Silas folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. When Mara came to this kitchen a half hour later and looked at him across the table, he told her everything Nathan had said. She listened without interrupting, with her hands around her coffee cup and her face very still. When he finished, she said, "Witnesses. I don't have any witnesses. Anyone who saw what happened is back in Seaton, and Victor knows all of them." She paused. "Except his mother." His mother? Helen Quinn. Something moved across her face. She saw things. She never said anything, but she saw them. She looked down at the coffee. I don't know if she'd speak. I don't know if she's brave enough. You know where she is? Garen's Fork. She never left, even after Victor stopped. Even after. Silas looked at her. Would she talk to you? I don't know, she said. Maybe. She loves Eli. She used to, before everything, before Victor convinced her I was the problem. She was good to me. Her jaw was tight. Victor is very good at convincing people that women are the problem. They sat with that. One thing at a time, Silas said. We write to her, see what she says. Mara nodded slowly. Then she said, very quietly, he's going to come here himself eventually. You know that. I know. Mercer not finding me won't be enough. Victor doesn't give up. I know that too. She looked at him. Aren't you afraid? Silas thought about it honestly. I've been afraid before, he said. Doesn't change much. Still have to do the thing. Mara Quinn looked at him across the kitchen table in the winter morning light, and Silas Boone looked back at her, and neither of them looked away. Outside, the mountain sat in its cold and ancient silence, and somewhere down the southern road, 3 horses turned back toward the ranch, with a man coming behind them who would not stop and would not quit, and believed with everything in him that what he owned could not leave him. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. The letter to Helen Quinn came back unopened. Mara held the envelope in both hands and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. The paper was wrinkled at the corners the way things got when they'd been handled by several people before coming back to the one who sent them, the postal rider, some clerk in Garen's Fork, whoever had decided to return it rather than deliver it. Someone had written a single word across the front in handwriting that wasn't Helen's. Gone. She moved, Mara said. Or someone moved her, Silas said. She set the envelope on the kitchen table and pressed her palm flat against it, like she was trying to feel through the paper to the message that hadn't gotten through. Then she took her hand away and went to check on Eli, and Silas looked at the envelope and thought about the word gone, and what it might mean about how much Victor Quinn already knew, and how far ahead of them he already was. That was the last week of January. February came in hard and stayed hard, the way February did in the Callaway Range. Not the dramatic violence of the January storms, but a grinding, relentless cold that settled into everything and refused to move. The kind of cold that crept under doors and into joints and made the mornings feel like something to be survived rather than started. Silas had been through 20+ of these mountain Februaries, and he was still not entirely reconciled to them. He just got through them, one day at a time, and eventually they ended. That was more or less what they were doing with everything else, too. Mercer's men had not come back to the ranch, but Silas had started seeing signs of them at the edges of his property. A campfire ring in the trees above the east pasture, not quite cold when he found it. Boot prints in the snow along the fence line that weren't his. One morning he found that someone had cut the wire on the north fence, clean cuts, deliberate, not a break from weather or age. And 3 of his cattle had wandered through before he found them. He repaired the fence without saying anything to Mara that night, but the next morning he got the second rifle down from the closet and put it on the table in front of her. She looked at it and then up at him. Do you know how to shoot? He asked. I know which end the bullet comes out of. That's a start. Come outside. She wrapped Eli up and put him in the basket near the stove with enough blankets to constitute a small fort, and she followed Silas out to the back of the property where the land flattened before it dropped off toward the creek. He set up a row of tin cans on the fence rail and showed her how to hold the rifle properly. Not just the mechanics of it, but the part that most people skipped, which was how to breathe, how to slow everything down until the moment became almost quiet. She missed the first 4 shots completely. The 5th clipped the edge of a can and sent it spinning. She lowered the rifle and looked at it. Again, she said, You've got time. Again, please. So they did it again. And again after that. She didn't complain about the cold, and she didn't complain about her shoulder, which was going to be bruised from the recoil by morning. She just reloaded and adjusted her stance and listened to his corrections with the specific kind of focus that came from understanding why the lesson mattered. By the end of the hour, she was hitting 2 out of every 3 cans. Good, Silas said. Not good enough, she said. But she said it to herself more than to him, already reloading. He watched her line up the next shot, the way she settled into the stance now, the way her breathing changed. And he thought that Mara Quinn had probably spent her whole marriage being told she wasn't capable of anything. And he thought about what it must feel like to discover, this late, that she was wrong about that. He didn't say any of that out loud. He just watched her hit the next 3 in a row. The days took on a shape that was part wariness and part something else. Something that neither of them named because naming it would have required a kind of conversation they weren't ready for yet. Silas rode the fence line every morning. He paid more attention to the road than he used to. He noticed Mara had started keeping the rifle within reach of wherever she was in the house, casual about it, like it was just another piece of equipment. What he also noticed, and tried to be careful about noticing too much, was that the house had become a different place than it had been in January. Not just clean and warm, though it was those things. Different in some harder-to-describe way, the way a space changed when it held people who were paying attention to each other. Eli had started recognizing Silas's boots on the floor before he came through the door. Mara had told him this with a small, complicated expression he hadn't been able to fully decode. And the baby would crane his neck toward the sound and make a noise that was pointed and specific. Silas had started crouching down to Eli's level when he came in, which was a thing he hadn't planned and hadn't decided to do. It had just started happening. Mara saw it. She didn't comment on it, which he appreciated. One evening in the second week of February, she came to find him in the barn where he was working on a cracked axle by lamplight. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed against the cold, and she said, without preamble, "I need to tell you the rest of it." He set down the wrench. "All right." She came inside and sat on the old milking stool in the corner and told him what she hadn't told him in January. Not because she'd been lying, but because there were parts she'd needed more time to say out loud. Victor Quinn was not just a man with debts and a temper. In the years before he'd faked his death, he'd become involved with men who operated outside the law in ways that went beyond simple borrowing. Men who moved stolen goods through the territory, who had arrangements with certain officials that made them effectively untouchable in 3 counties. Victor hadn't been at the center of it, but he'd been close enough to the center that walking away cleanly wasn't a thing he could do. The men he owed weren't just creditors. They were the kind of people who viewed an outstanding debt as a permanent claim. "That's why he burned the house," she said. "It wasn't just about the money. It was about disappearing from them, too. He needed everyone to think he was dead, not just his creditors." Silas was quiet, working through what that meant. "If Victor is hiding from those men," he said slowly, "then why is he spending money on a tracker and risking someone recognizing him? The risk of coming after you seems—" "Because I know," she said. "I know enough. Not everything, but enough. And Victor understands that a woman with nothing to lose and a lawyer who asks the right questions could create a problem for him that's worse than the men he's hiding from." She met his eyes. "He doesn't want me dead. He wants me back where he can see me, where I can't talk." The lamp threw long shadows across the barn walls. One of the horses shifted in its stall. "Mara," Silas said, "I need you to understand something. If what you're describing is accurate, if Victor is genuinely connected to people like that, then this is bigger than a custody dispute." "I know. Nathan needs to know all of this." "I know that too." She looked at her hands. "I didn't tell him in the first letter because I was still deciding how much to trust him, how much to trust anyone." She glanced up. "I'm still deciding." "That's fair," Silas said. "I trust you," she said simply and without apparent plan, as though she'd only realized it in the saying of it. He didn't answer right away. He turned the wrench over in his hands and looked at the cracked axle and then back at her. "Then let's write to Nathan again," he said. "Tonight. All of it." The second letter to Nathan Crowley was 3 pages long and took them most of the evening to compose. The 2 of them at the kitchen table with Eli asleep in the back room, and the wood stove ticking and the draft coming back twice, because Silas kept having to tell Mara to say more, not less, that the things she was summarizing were the things Nathan most needed to hear in full. "He needs the details," Silas said, "even the ones that are hard to say." "I know how to write a letter," she said a little sharply. "I know you do. I'm saying don't edit out the ugly parts because they make you feel ashamed." She put the pen down and looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between angry and something else. "I'm not ashamed," she said quietly. I'm tired of being the one who has to explain it. He didn't have a good answer for that, so he just said, I know, and meant it. And after a moment, she picked the pen back up and wrote the ugly parts too. They sent the letter the next morning. Nathan's reply took 11 days this time, and it was terse in the way his letters got when he was concerned and trying not to show it. He was looking into Victor Quinn's connections. He had a contact in the Territory Marshal's office who might be interested in certain information. He needed Mara to come to Harlan as soon as the roads were safe enough to give a proper deposition. He also wrote, in the last paragraph, a single line that Silas read twice. Tell her to be careful. Men like this don't send trackers first unless they're planning to come themselves eventually. Silas didn't show Mara that last line right away. He held it for 2 days, which he later admitted to himself was wrong of him, and then he showed her. She read it without expression and handed the letter back. I've known that since January, she said. He should have known she'd known. The snow finally broke in the 3rd week of February, 4 warm days in a row that softened the roads from impossible to merely bad. On the morning of the 5th day, Silas was saddling his horse to ride down to check the lower fence when he heard a rider coming up the road. Single horse, moving faster than the road conditions warranted. He came out of the barn and stood in the yard and watched the rider come. It wasn't Mercer. The man who rode up to his fence line was perhaps 45, and where Mercer had looked like money, this man just looked like authority. The calm, deliberate authority of someone who had never found it necessary to raise his voice because things had always gone the way he intended. He sat his horse the way men sat who'd been on horseback since they were children, and he was dressed for travel, not for show, but everything he wore was well made. His face was even-featured and still, and when he smiled, the smile was the kind of smile that required no warmth to function. He looked at Silas across the fence line and said, pleasantly, You must be Silas Boone. My name is Victor Quinn. I believe you've met my wife. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a confrontation that both men had known was coming, and neither one was going to pretend was a surprise. Silas didn't move from where he was standing. He didn't reach for anything. He just looked at Victor Quinn and kept his voice level and said, Your wife isn't here. Victor's smile stayed right where it was. Now, I don't think that's quite true, he said, and I don't think you're the kind of man who enjoys being dishonest. You don't look like it. He tilted his head slightly. I've been hearing about you, Mr. Boone. Widower, good reputation, works hard, keeps to himself. Everyone I've talked to says you're a straight-dealing man. The smile didn't waver. Which is why I have to say, I'm a little surprised you've gotten yourself into this situation. What situation is that? A man's wife and child are missing, Victor said, and there are people, good people, community-minded people, who might look sideways at a lonely widower who's been keeping another man's family on his property. He paused, letting that sit. I'm not here to cause trouble for you, Mr. Boone. I genuinely am not. I just want my family back. He said my family the way someone said my horse or my rifle, not with love, with ownership. If your wife is in danger, Silas said, or if she left because she had good reason to leave, then whatever you call your claim on her isn't really a legal matter of missing persons. Something moved behind Victor's eyes, fast and then gone. She's not well, he said, and his voice shifted into a register that was sympathetic and sad and clearly well practiced. Since the baby, she's had difficulty, confusion, poor judgment. It's a well-documented condition. I'm sure you've heard of it. I've been out of my mind with worry. He looked at Silas with the expression of a grieving husband. I don't blame her, and I don't blame you. If she told you things that weren't accurate, she's not herself. Silas looked at him for a moment. She seems herself to me, he said. The sympathetic expression didn't crack, but something behind it shifted. A slight tightening. Something that was the distant relative of the anger it was working hard to cover. I'd like to see her, Victor said. That's all. 5 minutes. Let me talk to her, and if she tells me to my face that she wants to stay here, I'll ride away and sort this through the proper channels. He spread his hands, the picture of reasonableness. That's all I'm asking. Silas thought about the bruise on Mara's jaw. He thought about the letter Nathan had written about men like this. He thought about the fence wire cut clean in the night and the campfire above the east pasture. I think you should go, he said, And I think the proper channels are a fine idea. Get yourself a lawyer. Write to the court in Harlan. Do it that way." Victor looked at him for a long moment. The smile was still there, technically. It had just stopped doing what smiles were supposed to do. "You're making a mistake," he said, quietly, the way the real warning always came, said, not loud, but underneath the pleasant surface. "You've got a nice thing here. Good land, solid reputation, people who respect you. Men who get involved in other people's domestic situations have a way of losing things like that." He gathered his reins. "I'm going to give you some time to think about what you're doing, out of respect for the kind of man I believe you are." He turned his horse and rode back down the mountain road at the same unhurried pace he'd come up it, and Silas stood in the yard and watched him go and did not move until the road was empty. Then he turned and went into the house. Mara was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had the rifle. She had heard all of it. "That was him," she said, not a question. "Yes." Her face had gone this color of creek water in March. Not white exactly, just drained of whatever warmth it usually held. She was gripping the rifle with both hands, and she was very still in the way that people were still when they were working hard not to shake. "He's calm," she said. "When he's that calm, it's worse." "I know. He won't stop." She said it the way you said a fact about weather or geography. Not despairing, just accurate. He's not going to get a lawyer and go through the courts and accept whatever they decide. That's not who he is. That's just what he says in front of people. "Then we make sure we're ready," Silas said, "and we get to Nathan before Victor does." She looked at him. Her knuckles were white on the rifle stock. "He told you I was sick," she said. "Didn't he? That's the thing he does. Confused after the baby, not reliable, can't be trusted to know what she wants." "He did," Silas said. "And?" He met her eyes. "I told him you seemed yourself to me." Mara Quinn stood in the kitchen doorway of his ranch house on a cold February morning, holding a rifle, and looking at him with an expression that was complicated enough that he couldn't have named all of it, relief and grief, and something fierce underneath both of them. And she said, very quietly, "We need to go to Harlan." "Yes," Silas said, "we do." Outside, the mountain road sat empty under a pale winter sky, and somewhere down it, Victor Quinn rode back toward wherever he'd come from, already planning what came next. And that same night, after Eli was asleep and the house was dark and quiet, something struck the front window with a force that brought both of them out of their rooms with their rifles up. A rock, wrapped in a strip of paper, the glass cracked but not broken. Silas unwrapped the paper by lamplight while Mara stood at his shoulder. 3 words, written in a careful hand. "Time is running out." She looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket, and she said nothing, and she went back to check on Eli. Silas stood in the cold draft coming through the cracked glass and held the lamp and looked out at the dark yard where there was nothing moving now. Just the empty mountain night, the bare trees, the road that led somewhere Victor Quinn was sleeping easy and certain of himself. He was wrong to be certain, but he didn't know that yet. They left for Harlan 4 days after the rock came through the window. Silas boarded up the cracked glass the morning after it happened, and he spent the next 3 days quietly doing what needed doing before he could be gone from the ranch for any stretch of time, arranging for his neighbor Dalt Henner, a taciturn old man who ran cattle 2 ridges over, to check the property and water the animals. He packed what Mara would need, which wasn't much because she'd arrived with almost nothing and accumulated only slightly more than that. He packed what Eli would need, which was considerably more than you'd expect from someone who weighed 15 pounds. Mara spent those 3 days neither panicking nor pretending she wasn't afraid, which Silas had come to understand was the particular way she moved through difficult things. Not fearless, just determined not to let fear make the decisions. She went through the papers she'd been carrying since she left Seton, things she'd sewn into the lining of Eli's blanket because it was the one thing she knew she'd never put down. There weren't many. A marriage certificate, a letter from a doctor who treated her for a broken wrist 18 months ago, where the cause of injury was listed, blandly, as a fall. A piece of paper with a column of figures in Victor's handwriting, debts, amounts, names, that she'd taken from his desk drawer 6 months before he burned the house. She spread these on the kitchen table and looked at them and then looked at Silas. "Is it enough?" she asked. He looked at the papers and thought about what Nathan had written and thought about Victor's face on horseback, that practiced calm. "It's a start," he said, which was honest. The road to Harlan took 2 days by wagon in good conditions. In late February conditions, with Eli and all his associated requirements, it took 3. They stayed the middle night at a way station where the woman who ran it gave Mara a look that lasted about 2 seconds longer than necessary, taking in the baby, the absence of a wedding ring, the man she'd arrived with who was clearly not her husband. Silas met the look without explanation and asked for 2 separate rooms, which seemed to disappoint the woman's theories without entirely dispelling them. Mara noticed. She didn't say anything until they were in the narrow hallway between the rooms, Eli drowsing against her shoulder. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," she said quietly, "about me being here, about any of it. I know that. I don't want to be a problem for you, on top of everything else." He looked at her in the dim hallway light. She had dark circles under her eyes from 3 days of travel and a baby who'd decided the wagon was not conducive to sleep, and she was still standing straight, still holding Eli like he weighed nothing. "Mara," he said, "go to sleep." She almost smiled. "Yes, sir," she said, and went through her door, and he went through his, and he lay on the narrow way station bed and stared at the ceiling for a while before sleep came. Nathan Crowley met them at his office in Harlan the morning of the 3rd day, and he was not what Silas had perhaps made him sound like in his letters, not a dramatic figure, not a man who filled a room. He was small and precise and wore his glasses slightly crooked, and he had the habit of looking at you over the top of them when he was thinking hard about something, which was most of the time. He shook Silas's hand and then turned to Mara and shook hers too, which she seemed to notice. "Mrs. Quinn," he said, "sit down. I've got coffee if you want it, and I need about 2 hours of your time, and I want you to tell me everything you told Silas and then everything you didn't," she told him. All of it, in Nathan's spare paper-stacked office with Eli on her lap, and the winter sun coming through the window at an angle that put a rectangle of pale light across the floor. Nathan listened and wrote and asked questions, precise, specific questions that weren't gentle but were respectful. And Silas watched Mara answer them with a steadiness he found remarkable, given that some of what she was answering was the kind of thing that had the capacity to break your voice in the middle of it. When she was done, Nathan set down his pen and looked at the papers she'd brought, and then looked at her over his glasses. "The doctor's letter is useful," he said. "The figures in Quinn's handwriting are potentially very useful, though what they prove depends on who we can get to corroborate the names on them." He paused. "I've been doing some looking into Victor Quinn. He has a history, not a legal one, nothing that went to court, but a pattern. There are people in Seton who know things they haven't said formally." He picked up the glasses, cleaned them, put them back. "Here's the difficulty. Quinn has already filed in this county. He filed 2 weeks ago before you arrived." Mara went very still. "He filed what?" Silas said. "Petition for the return of a minor child," Nathan said. And this is the part I want you to hear clearly, Mrs. Quinn, because it is going to be unpleasant. He's also filed a claim that you left the marital home in a state of mental instability following childbirth, and that you've been detained and influenced by a third party." He looked at her steadily. "He means Silas. He's filed a claim that Silas Boone has effectively kidnapped you." The word landed in the office like something dropped from a height. "That's insane," Silas said. "It's tactically smart," Nathan said without satisfaction. "It reframes the entire situation. Instead of a man pursuing a woman who fled abuse, it becomes a case of a man trying to recover his confused wife from someone who took advantage of her. It puts Mara in the position of having to prove she's of sound mind, and it puts you, Silas, in the position of defending your character and your motives." He let them sit with that for a moment. "I filed counter petitions this morning. I want this heard as quickly as possible before he can build more of a case. Judge Aldred has a date available in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Mara said. "I know it feels long. He knows I'm here now, in Harlan. He filed before I even arrived, which means he knew I was coming, which means—" She stopped, looked at Silas. "Someone at the way station," Silas said quietly. She nodded once, and neither of them said anything more about it. There was no point. "Where will you stay?" Nathan asked. "There's a boarding house on Clement Street," Silas said. "I've used it before." "Good. Stay together. Not for appearances, just for safety. I don't want either of you alone if I can help it." Nathan stood, which was the signal that the official part of the meeting was over, and then he did something Silas hadn't expected. He looked at Mara directly and said, "Mrs. Quinn, I've handled cases like this before, and I won't lie to you about the fact that they're difficult. But I want you to know that the filing Victor Quinn made this morning is the filing of a man who is afraid of what you know and what you can say in front of a judge. Men who are winning don't file defensive claims. They file offensive ones." He paused. "He's more scared of you than you are of him. He's just better at hiding it." Mara looked at him for a moment. "He's not scared of me," she said. "He's scared of losing something he thinks he owns." Nathan held her gaze. "For men like him," he said, "that's the same thing." The 3 weeks before the hearing were the longest Silas could remember since the winter Eleanor died. They were staying in 2 rooms at the Clement Street boarding house, and the town of Harlan had begun to develop opinions about the situation the way small towns developed opinions, quickly, with confidence, and with varying degrees of accuracy. Victor Quinn had arrived in Harlan 8 days before the hearing and had immediately set about being visible in exactly the right ways, attending the Sunday gathering at the community hall, having dinner at the hotel restaurant where the county commissioner ate, being seen on the street looking worried and respectable and aggrieved in a dignified fashion. He was very good at it. Mara watched him from across the street one afternoon, through the boarding house window, and she said nothing for a long time. "He's telling everyone I left because I lost my mind," she said finally. "Nathan knows. He's managing it. You can't manage a story once it's in the air." She turned from the window. "I've seen him do this before. In Seton, when things started going wrong, he got ahead of everything, made sure everyone knew his version first. By the time I understood what was happening, half the town already thought I was unstable." Her jaw was tight. "He practices being sympathetic. I don't know how else to say it. He actually practices." She wasn't wrong. Silas had seen it on horseback outside the ranch, that flawless performance of the worried husband. He thought about what it took to do that. To stand in front of a man while your hired trackers were cutting that man's fences at night, and look genuinely sorrowful about the whole situation. "3 more days, he said. 3 more days, she said, and went to pick up Eli, who'd started to fuss. The courthouse in Harlan was a 2-story brick building that had more dignity from the outside than from the inside, where the benches were splintered and the windows didn't close all the way, and Judge Aldred's bench had a wobble on the left side that he'd apparently stopped noticing. The courtroom was full, more full than Silas had expected, and the faces in the gallery were a mix of the curious and the partisan, people who'd already decided what they thought and were there to have it confirmed. Victor was at his table with his lawyer, a man named Hargrove, who had the expensive suit and small eyes of someone who'd built a career on finding the technical angle. Victor was dressed soberly and well. When Mara came through the door, he looked at her with an expression of such tender pain that several people in the gallery reacted to it before they'd heard a word of testimony. She didn't look at him. She sat beside Nathan, and she put her hands flat on the table in front of her, and she fixed her eyes on Judge Aldred's bench, and she breathed. Silas sat in the front row of the gallery, which was the closest he could be. Hargrove opened by telling the story Victor had been telling around town. The devoted husband, the difficult pregnancy, the wife who'd become confused and frightened and had been, in her fragile state, taken in by a well-meaning but misguided man who'd filled her head with suspicions and paranoia. He said postpartum several times. He said mental instability the way you said unfortunate weather, not accusatory, just regrettable. He said the child rather than Eli's name, and Silas noticed that and thought it probably said something true about Victor Quinn, that his lawyer had been coached not to use his son's name. Nathan countered with the medical letter and the document of debts, and he walked through the timeline of Mara's departure and the circumstances of Victor's faked death. And there was a murmur in the gallery at that part that Hargrove immediately tried to redirect by suggesting the fire was accidental and the death declaration a clerical confusion in a rural county. Then they called Mara to the stand. She'd known this was coming. She'd prepared for it. But Silas watched her walk to the stand, and he saw the moment she crossed in front of Victor's table. The slight adjustment of her spine, the lift of her chin that was so small most people wouldn't notice it, the way she was physically managing the proximity to him. And he understood that no amount of preparation made this particular thing easy. Hargrove questioned her for 40 minutes. It was a skilled 40 minutes. He never raised his voice. He never accused her directly of lying. He just asked questions in sequences that were designed to make her answers sound confused or contradictory, that returned repeatedly to the theme of her emotional state after childbirth, that suggested, without quite stating, that a woman who'd walked 10 miles in a blizzard with a baby was not demonstrating good judgment, but rather dangerous irrationality. He asked her about Silas, how they'd met, how quickly he'd offered her shelter, whether she'd considered that a man who'd been alone for 8 years might have reasons of his own for wanting a woman and child in his house. She answered steadily, not robotically. She faltered once, on a question about the night of the fire, and her voice dropped and she had to stop for a moment. That was real, and it read as real, and Silas watched the gallery and saw that some of them saw it that way too. But then Hargrove made a mistake. He pushed on the question of the fire one more time, asked her gently and terribly whether it was possible she had been confused about what she saw that night, whether grief and fear might have caused her to misinterpret an accident as something intentional. And Mara looked at him for a moment with an expression that was very quiet and very clear. "I know what I saw," she said, "and I know what I lived with for 4 years before that night. I didn't run because I was confused. I ran because I understood exactly what was happening." She paused. "And I want to say something that isn't an answer to your question, but I'm going to say it anyway. My son's name is Eli. He's 8 months old. He doesn't talk yet, but he has opinions about everything, and one of them is that he doesn't like loud noises. In 4 years of marriage, loud noises were," she stopped, recalibrated, "frequent. That's all I want to say about that." The gallery was very quiet. Judge Aldred looked at her over his spectacles and then wrote something down. Nathan called 2 witnesses, the doctor from Seton, who'd treated her wrist, who testified carefully about the nature and position of the injury, and a woman named Carla Betts, who'd lived 2 doors down from the Quinn house in Seton, and who'd asked Mara once, in the privacy of her kitchen, whether she was all right, and had received an answer she hadn't forgotten. Then Nathan called Silas. He sat in the witness chair and answered Nathan's questions plainly and without embellishment. What he'd seen when he opened the door in the blizzard, what Mara had told him, what Mercer had said to him, what Victor had said to him on the road. He told it the way it happened. He didn't reach for eloquence. Then Hargrove stood up. "Mr. Boone," he said pleasantly, "you're a widower, is that correct?" "Yes." "How long have you been alone on that ranch?" 8 years. "And in those 8 years, have you had much company?" "Women, specifically." Nathan was already on his feet. Judge Aldred sustained before he'd finished the objection. Hargrove tried a different angle. He suggested that a man alone that long might be susceptible to developing an attachment quickly. That loneliness had a way of warping judgment, that Silas might genuinely believe he was helping Mrs. Quinn while simultaneously being motivated by something he hadn't examined honestly in himself. Silas looked at Hargrove for a moment. "You're asking if I have feelings for Mara Quinn," he said. Hargrove spread his hands. "I'm asking whether your judgment in this situation might be compromised by—" "Yes," Silas said. The gallery shifted. Victor's head came up fractionally. "I have feelings for her," Silas said. "I'm not going to sit up here and pretend I don't, because I've been told that's where honest men end up, when they try to hide something that isn't wrong to feel." He looked at the judge rather than Hargrove. "What I know is what I saw. She walked 10 miles in a blizzard carrying her baby because she was more afraid of going back than she was of the storm. I've seen afraid, and I've seen the kind of afraid that makes a person walk 10 miles in January. Those are different kinds of afraid." He paused. "And I know what Mercer said on my road, and I know what Victor Quinn said on my road, and I know what kind of man says those things." The courtroom was quiet again. Then from the gallery, near the back, there was a sound, a woman's voice, thin and wavering, saying, "I need to speak." The room turned. Standing near the back door, holding the frame as though she needed it for support, was an older woman in a gray traveling coat. Her hair was white-streaked and pinned inexpertly, and her face had the particular quality of someone who'd spent a long time being small and had decided, at significant personal cost, to stop. Victor Quinn had gone absolutely, completely still. "Ma'am," Judge Aldred said, "this is not—" "My name is Helen Quinn," the woman said. "Victor is my son, and I have something to say." The room erupted and Judge Aldred hammered it down, and Nathan was on his feet requesting she be permitted to give testimony, and Hargrove was objecting, and Victor was leaning toward his lawyer saying something sharp and quiet. And through all of it, Helen Quinn stood in the back of the courtroom holding the door frame and looking at the floor in front of her with the expression of someone who'd been building up to this for longer than the morning. They cleared the procedural objections in 15 minutes, which was fast. And Helen Quinn took the stand with the slow deliberateness of a woman whose knees were not reliable and whose resolve was. She didn't look at Victor. She looked at the judge. "I saw my son hit his wife," she said, without being asked. "More than once. I saw the first time when Mara was 3 months pregnant, and I told myself it wouldn't happen again, and I was wrong about that." Her voice was unsteady, but her words were not. "I didn't say anything because he's my son, and because I was afraid of him. I've been afraid of Victor since he was 17 years old." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "His father was the same way. I stayed with his father for 20 years, and I told myself I was doing right by my children, and what I was actually doing was teaching Victor that this was how a man treated a woman." The gallery was completely silent. "I got the letter Mrs. Quinn sent in January," Helen said. "Someone had it returned before it reached me. I think Victor's people watched the mail. But I found out about it, and I found out where she'd gone, and I drove 3 days to get here." She finally looked at Nathan. "I'll sign whatever I need to sign. I'll say whatever I need to say in front of whoever needs to hear it. I should have said it a long time ago," Victor Quinn said, in a voice that was still controlled but only barely. "Mother, don't," she said, and she said it with a quietness that carried across the entire room. "I'm talking now." What happened in the next 20 minutes was not clean or dramatic, in the way courthouse confrontations sometimes were in stories. Helen's testimony was halting and occasionally contradictory, and Hargrove went after the contradictions without mercy. She cried twice and had to stop, and the second time she stopped, Victor made a sound, a short, contemptuous sound, almost a laugh, that was not loud, but that several people in the gallery heard. Judge Aldred heard it. He looked at Victor Quinn over his spectacles with the expression of a man filing something away. Hargrove called Victor to the stand for his own testimony, and Victor was composed and articulate and responsive, and he looked at the judge with open, reasonable eyes and spoke about his wife with careful sorrow, and he was very convincing for a long time, right up until Hargrove asked him about his mother's testimony, clearly intending for Victor to respond with pained understanding of an old woman's confusion. Instead, Victor Quinn looked at his mother in the gallery and said, "She's been unwell for years. She doesn't always know what she's saying." Helen Quinn looked at her son from the gallery bench with an expression that had moved past hurt into something more final, and she said nothing. But 3 jurors in the box shifted in their seats, and Judge Aldred wrote something else down. After Victor stepped down, there was a period of filings and arguments and procedural things that Silas mostly followed and occasionally lost track of. And then Judge Aldred called a recess and went to his chambers. And the courtroom broke into a noise that was partly argument and partly the particular excited murmur of people who'd witnessed something they were going to be talking about for a while. Mara sat at Nathan's table, and she did not turn around to look at Victor, and she did not look at the gallery. She looked at her hands on the table until Silas came through the bar and sat beside her, which technically he wasn't supposed to do. But Nathan didn't say anything. "How are you doing?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me after." He nodded. They sat together in the clearing noise of the courtroom and waited. When Judge Aldred came back, he granted a temporary protection order. He granted Mara and Eli leave to remain at Silas Boone's property in the Callaway Range pending the final custody hearing, which he scheduled for 60 days out. He said several things about the nature of the testimony he'd heard that stopped just short of what he could officially say at this stage, but that were clear enough in their direction. Victor Quinn sat at his table and received this information without visible reaction, and then he stood and buttoned his coat and picked up his hat, and he walked toward the door with Hargrove close behind him. He passed within 3 feet of Mara's table. He didn't look at her, but he said it quietly enough that only she and Silas and Nathan could hear it. "This isn't the end of anything." Then he was gone through the door, and the room filled back up with the sound of people talking, and Nathan started going through papers, and Eli, who'd been managed by the boarding house woman in the hall throughout all of it, and was now carried in by her, made the loud and unambiguous sound of someone who had been patient long enough. Mara took him and held him and pressed her face against the top of his head, and her shoulders did something that Silas looked away from because it was hers and not his to watch. Outside the courthouse, the sky had gone the low gray of an afternoon that was thinking about more snow. They stood on the steps, Silas and Mara and Nathan and Eli, and Helen Quinn, who'd come out behind them and stood a little apart, uncertain of her welcome. Mara looked at her for a moment. Then she crossed the steps and stood in front of her. Helen Quinn looked at her son's wife with eyes that had been crying recently and were done with it now. "I'm sorry," Helen said. "I know it's late." Mara looked at her for a long moment. "It got here," she said finally. "That's what matters." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It wasn't absolution. It was just what it was. Two women standing on courthouse steps in the cold, both of them having told the truth today for the first time in a long time and leaving it at that. They went back to this boarding house. Nathan went back to his office to file papers. The snow started, soft and quiet, and covered the street in front of the courthouse and the steps where they'd been standing, and covered Victor Quinn's boot prints in the mud at the bottom, and covered the road he'd ridden out on. And in the small room at the boarding house, after Eli was finally, mercifully asleep, Mara sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and said, "He meant it, what he said walking out." "I know," Silas said. 60 days is a long time." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going back," she said. "I want to be clear about that. No matter what happens in 60 days. I'm not going back." Silas looked at her. "I know that too," he said. Outside, the snow came down over Harlan, and somewhere in the town, Victor Quinn was in a room planning the next 60 days of his life. And the piece of paper on Nathan Crowley's desk that said temporary was the only thing in the world that currently separated what Mara had from what she needed. 60 days. It was going to be a long 60 days. They drove back to the ranch in the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was full, packed with everything that had happened in that courtroom and everything that still had to happen, and neither of them tried to talk over it. Eli slept most of the way, wedged between them on the wagon seat in his blanket bundle, which was the most relaxed any of them had been in 3 days. The ranch looked the same as they'd left it. Dalt Henner had done what he'd promised. The animals were watered, the barn doors were latched. There was a note on the kitchen table that said, "All fine, cattle in lower field, your east fence is cut again." And that last part was the only part that mattered, because it told them that while they'd been in Harlan standing in front of a judge, Victor's people had been here. Silas read the note and folded it and put it in his pocket and went out to check the fence without saying anything. Mara put Eli down and stood in the kitchen for a moment, just standing, the way you stood in a place after you'd been gone from it and needed to relearn that it was still there. Then she lit the stove and started making something to eat because it was past supper and they hadn't had a real meal since morning. He came back in an hour later, cold and mud-footed, and she put a plate in front of him without comment. They ate. 3 cuts, he said. Different section than last time. They're mapping the fence line, she said. He looked at her. That's what I thought. Victor likes to know the edges of things, she said, where a property begins and ends, where a person's limits are. She pushed food around her plate. It's how he operates. He tests the boundary until he finds the weak place. Silas thought about that. Then we don't give him a weak place. There's always a weak place, she said, not pessimistically, just factually. The question is whether you're standing at it when he finds it. That was the texture of the next 60 days. The awareness of being watched from the tree line, the daily checking of fences and water and the small signs that told you whether the night had been quiet or not. Victor's men didn't come to the door again. They didn't need to. Their presence at the edges of the property was itself the message. We are still here, we are still watching, the clock is still running. It was a particular kind of pressure, the kind that didn't come from one large thing but from 100 small ones accumulating, and Silas knew from ranching that that kind of pressure was often more effective than anything direct, because it wore at a person in the hours when nothing was actually happening. He tried not to let it show. He was not entirely successful. Mara noticed everything. She noticed the way he started checking the window before he lit the lamp at night. She noticed that he slept lighter now. Not that she could hear him sleeping, but she could tell by morning by the set of his face when he came to breakfast, whether the night had been easy or not. She didn't say anything about it for 3 weeks, and then one evening she said, "You're allowed to be tired, you know." He was mending harness at the kitchen table. He looked up. "I'm fine." "You're not sleeping." "I sleep." "Silas." She set down what she was doing, which was a shirt of Eli's that had developed a hole in the elbow. "You don't have to perform fine for me. I know what fine looks like, and I know what it looks like when someone's working hard to look fine, and those are different things." He put down the harness, looked at the table for a moment. "I keep thinking about the fence," he said, "the east section, the pattern of where they're cutting. There's a stretch near the creek that's harder to check from the house, and I can't—" He stopped. "I can't watch all of it." "No," she said. "You can't." "That bothers me." "I know." She picked the shirt back up. "It should bother you. That's the point. Victor wants it to bother you until you make a mistake, or until you decide it's not worth it." She pushed the needle through the fabric. "He did the same thing to me for 4 years. Made sure there was always something slightly wrong, always something slightly off. So I never felt like I could just rest." She looked up. "Don't let him take your sleep, Silas. That's what he wants." Easier said than done, and she knew that too. But there was something in having it named that helped, even a little. He went back to the harness. "You're pretty good at reading people," he said. "I had a good teacher," she said. "Bad one, I mean. Same result." He looked at her. The profile, the needle moving through cloth, the way she said hard things in a flat voice that was its own kind of toughness. And he thought about what it cost a person to learn the things she'd learned and still come out the other side able to sit at a kitchen table and say them out loud. He went back to the harness and didn't say what he was thinking because he was still figuring out when to say things and when to let them be. April came, and the mountain started its slow, reluctant thaw. The snow in the upper pastures went gray and granular and began to pull back from the fence lines, and the mud season arrived with its particular misery. The roads went soft, and the yard was impossible, and everything was the color of old coffee for about 3 weeks. But under all of it, something was happening that Silas noticed more in retrospect than in the moment. The ranch was coming alive again, and not just in the seasonal way. Mara had planted things in the kitchen garden. He hadn't asked her to. It had just appeared one morning, the near corner of the south-facing patch, cleared and turned, seeds in rows so straight they were clearly the product of someone with a strong opinion about disorder. Eli, now 10 months old and deeply committed to the project of movement without yet having mastered it, had begun pulling himself upright against the furniture and regarding the distance between objects with the calculating expression of someone planning a campaign. He had developed a specific relationship with Silas that had evolved from solemn evaluation to something that looked, on Eli's part, a lot like preference. He reached for Silas when Silas came into the room. He made a particular sound when he heard the boots on the floor. It was not a thing Silas had expected to happen to him. He was in the barn one afternoon in the second week of April, Eli strapped to his chest in the cloth arrangement Mara had engineered for exactly this purpose, showing the baby the horse situation in what he privately felt was an educational way, when Mara appeared in the barn doorway. "Nathan's written," she said. She had the letter. He came out of the stall and she handed it to him, and he read it with Eli attempting to eat the letter's corner. Victor had gotten a new lawyer. Nathan didn't know the man personally, but knew the reputation. A courthouse attorney from the capital who specialized in domestic cases and had a win record that Nathan described as impressive and achieved through methods I find professionally objectionable. Victor was also, per Nathan's contacts, moving money around in ways that suggested he was preparing for a significant legal expenditure. He was going to come into the final hearing with everything he had. "He's escalating," Silas said. "He always escalates when he's not winning," Mara said. She didn't take the letter back. "What else does Nathan say?" "He wants us in Harlan 4 days before the hearing, wants time to prepare." Silas refolded the letter. "He also says Helen Quinn has signed a formal affidavit, full account of what she witnessed." Mara was quiet for a moment. "She actually did it," she said. "She did. I wasn't sure she would. After Victor—" She stopped. "He's not kind to people who betray him. She knows that." "Maybe she decided she'd rather be afraid of him from the right side of it," Silas said. Mara looked at him. Something moved across her face that was close to wonder. Not at Helen exactly, but at the general possibility of people doing the right thing after years of not doing it. Maybe, she said. Eli, between them, pulled the refolded letter out of Silas's hand and attempted the corner again. That's evidence, Silas told him. Eli's expression suggested he disagreed about the hierarchy of its uses. Silas, Mara said. Something in her voice made him look up from the baby. She was standing in the barn doorway with the afternoon light at her back, and she had the look of someone who'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided to stop thinking and start saying. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to just hear it and not respond immediately, because I have trouble saying things twice. All right. I don't dream about leaving anymore. She said it simply, looking at him directly in the way she had that made looking away feel wrong. For months, since before I left Seton, since before Eli was born even, whenever I let myself think about what I wanted, the only thing I could picture was somewhere else. Somewhere that wasn't where I was. I couldn't picture a specific place, just away. She paused. Now, when I think about what I want, I see here. This. She gestured slightly, a small motion that included the barn and the yard and presumably the house behind it. I see Eli learning to walk in that kitchen. I see the garden coming up. I see... She stopped again. I see you. Silas looked at her. I'm not saying it to put something on you, she said quickly. I know the timing is... I know everything is still... I just needed you to know, because I have been not telling you for a long time, and I think not telling you was starting to be its own kind of dishonesty. He walked the 2 steps to where she was standing in the doorway, and he stood in front of her, Eli between them in the cloth harness, looking back and forth between their faces with enormous interest. Mara, he said, you don't have to. When this is over, he said, when the hearing is done, and Nathan has filed everything that needs filing, and Victor has been told by a judge in terms he cannot misinterpret, I want to ask you something. I'm not asking it now because the answer deserves to exist on its own, not inside all of this. He looked at her steadily. But I want you to know that I'm going to ask it. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her working through what he'd said, taking it seriously the way she took everything seriously. All right, she said quietly. All right, he said. They stood in the barn doorway in the April light, and Eli grabbed a fistful of Silas's shirt and held on. They drove to Harlan 2 weeks later with the roads still soft from mud season, and Eli in a more opinionated relationship with wagon travel than ever before. He was pulling himself upright against things and taking experimental single steps now, which had introduced an entirely new category of concern to every situation. Mara had started saying Eli, no approximately 40 times a day, which Eli received with the serenity of someone who understood that the word existed but had not yet accepted its authority. Nathan met with them for 3 long days before the hearing. He was thorough in the way he'd always been thorough, but Silas could tell there was something different about this round. A tightness in Nathan's precision that spoke to how seriously he was taking the new lawyer Victor had brought in. He made Mara go through her testimony 6 times. Not because she was inconsistent, she wasn't, but because he wanted her comfortable enough with it that Victor's lawyer couldn't shake her with the approach angle. He's going to come at the adultery question, Nathan said on the second evening. It's his cleanest play. You were on Silas's property for 2 months before we filed anything. He's going to imply the relationship was established before you left, that it was the reason you left. That's not true, Mara said. I know it's not, but in a courtroom not true and unprovable can look the same from the gallery. He looked at her over his glasses. How are you going to handle it when he asks? She thought about it for a moment. The truth, she said. I walked to the ranch because it was the only building within 10 miles, and I had a baby, and it was 20 below zero. He can call that adultery if he wants to. I call it surviving. Nathan looked at her and then wrote something down. Good, he said. Say it exactly like that. The morning of the hearing, Silas woke at 4 and lay in the dark boarding house room and stared at the ceiling. The room was quiet. He could hear faintly from the next room Eli's small sleeping sounds. The baby had developed the habit of making a particular noise in deep sleep, a rhythmic, contented sound that Silas found inexplicably reassuring. He thought about what he was going to say when they asked him. He thought about Eleanor. Not with guilt. He'd spent enough time with the guilt, carried it long enough to know its shape, and know that it was not, at this point, something he was supposed to keep carrying. He just thought about her the way you thought about a road you'd been on that brought you to where you were, without regret and without pretending it hadn't happened. Then he got up and dressed and went down to see if the kitchen was open yet. The courtroom felt different this time, smaller somehow. The same cracked benches and badly closing windows, but the room had filled overnight with the particular weight of a thing about to be settled. Victor's new lawyer, whose name was Carver, was already at his table when they arrived, and he had the stillness of a man who'd done this many times and found each time pretty much the same as the last. Victor sat beside him looking exactly as he'd looked 60 days ago. Composed, well-dressed, sympathetically pained. The performance hadn't slipped at all. Silas found that almost impressive in the way that certain dangerous things were impressive. The hearing opened, and Carver was immediately everything Nathan had warned them he'd be. Precise, cold, and surgically effective at finding the seam in an argument and pressing on it. He worked through the timeline of Mara's departure with the patience of someone who had all day and wanted the gallery to feel every uncomfortable implication of every date. He established that Mara had gone to Silas Boone's ranch, rather than to family, rather than to the law, rather than to any of the respectable options available to a woman in genuine distress. He lingered on that. He returned to it. Then he called Victor to the stand. Victor testified for 40 minutes, and in those 40 minutes he was everything Mara had described. A man who practiced being sympathetic, who could produce the exact correct emotion at the exact correct moment, who knew how to let grief show in his face in the way that made watchers feel they were seeing something private. He talked about Mara with a sorrow that was indistinguishable from love. He talked about Eli with a longing that, if you hadn't read the pattern of it, if you didn't know what Silas knew, would have moved you. He talked about Silas with a pity that was the most insulting thing Silas had ever heard said about him. Then Nathan stood up, and he did what he'd been preparing to do for 60 days. He walked Victor Quinn through the fake death. Not quickly, slowly, methodically, every document in order, the burn patterns from the fire report, the affidavit from the claims adjuster, the records from 3 counties that showed Victor Quinn very much alive and moving money around in the weeks following his supposed death. He walked him through the debts, the names on that paper Mara had taken from the desk drawer, the affidavit from a man in Seaton who'd been owed money and had never been paid. He walked him through Mercer's visit to Silas's ranch and the cut fence wire and the rock through the window. And then he read Helen Quinn's affidavit into the record. Every word of it. The courtroom had been getting quieter with each piece Nathan laid down, the way a room went quiet when it was absorbing something it hadn't quite believed before. By the time Nathan finished reading Helen's words, the gallery was the kind of silent where you could hear the building settle. Victor's face had been doing something during the reading, something he was working very hard to contain. And when Nathan sat down and Carver leaned over to confer with him, Victor looked at Mara across the room with an expression that was finally, for the first time in a public space, undisguised. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3. But Judge Aldred was looking at him when it happened. Then Mara went to the stand, and she told the story one more time, and she told it in the way she'd told it to Silas in the barn in January. Not for effect, not performing courage, just saying what had happened in the sequence that it happened, because that was all the truth required. When Carver stood to question her, he went immediately to the adultery claim. He was polished about it, framing it as concern for the child's welfare, for the morality of the environment Eli was being raised in. And he asked Mara directly whether her relationship with Silas Boone had begun before she left the marital home. She looked at him. I walked to the ranch because it was the only building within 10 miles, and I had a baby, and it was 20 below zero, she said. He can call that adultery if he wants to. I call it surviving. She said it exactly as she'd told Nathan she would. There was a sound in the gallery that wasn't quite a response, but was something. A collective exhale, a shift. Carver tried one more angle, asking about Silas's motivations, whether a lonely widower might have his own reasons for inserting himself into a marriage. Mara looked at him for a moment and said, he opened his door in a blizzard to a woman he'd never seen and a baby he hadn't been asked to take in, and he has never once asked me for anything in return. If you want to call that suspicious, I think that says more about what you expect from people than it does about him. Carver sat down. Silas was called to the stand. He answered Nathan's questions and then Carver's questions, and Carver came at him from several directions looking for the soft place, and Silas just answered each thing as plainly as he could. He didn't perform anything. He was tired of performing things. At one point, Carver said, "Mr. Boone, would you say you're in love with this woman?" And Silas said, "Yes, I would." And the courtroom made its noise, and Judge Aldred made his gavel do its work. And Carver tried to follow up with something about compromised judgment, but Silas just looked at him and said, "Loving someone doesn't make you wrong about what you saw. I saw what I saw, and I told you what I saw, and that's where I am." Carver had no good answer for that, so he sat down. Victor Quinn made his final statement to the court through Carver, who was professional about it, and then there was the waiting. That particular courthouse waiting that had its own texture, people milling and not looking at each other. Mara sitting at Nathan's table with her hands flat in front of her the same way she'd sat 60 days ago, like she'd learned that keeping her hands flat helped. Silas sat beside her. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. She looked at him after about 10 minutes and said, "Whatever happens," "I know," he said. "I need to say it." "All right. Whatever happens in there, I meant what I said in the barn. I see here when I think about what I want. That doesn't change based on what a judge says." He looked at her. "I know," he said again. And then, "Same." She looked at the table, breathed. "Okay," she said. Victor across the room was speaking quietly with Carver, and his face was back to being what it always was in public. Controlled, appropriate, unreadable. But his left hand, on the table in front of him, was pressing down flat and hard, the knuckles slightly blanched, and Silas watched that hand and thought about what it told you, that the only place the truth showed up was in what a person's hand was doing when they thought no one was watching. Judge Aldred came back. He took his seat, adjusted the papers in front of him, and looked out at the courtroom with the expression of a man who'd formed his conclusion and was now putting it in the order that served the record. He spoke for several minutes before he came to the thing everyone was waiting for, going through procedural language and findings of fact and the standard architecture of these decisions. Silas sat and listened and kept his hands still. Then Judge Aldred said, "In the matter of custody of Eli Quinn, minor child, this court finds in favor of the mother, Mara Quinn, and grants full and permanent custody accordingly." The gallery broke open. Victor Quinn was on his feet and Carver was grabbing his arm, and Victor was saying something that couldn't be heard over the noise, and Judge Aldred's gavel came down 3 times, and Victor's voice broke through the surface finally. Sharp and ugly, and not practiced at all. And then Carver had him by the arm in earnest, and was speaking in his ear, and Victor stood there breathing hard with his face doing the thing it did when there was nobody left to perform for. Judge Aldred looked at him. "Mr. Quinn," he said, with a particular quiet authority that landed better than volume would have, "I will remind you that you are in my courtroom." Victor sat down. The rest took another 20 minutes. The dissolving of the marriage, the restraining provisions, the terms that put Victor Quinn on the wrong side of a legal boundary he could not cross without consequences that would finally outweigh whatever satisfaction he got from crossing it. Each item was read into the record with the same flat judicial language, and each one landed differently. Not like a victory exactly, but like things being put back in the correct order after a long time of being wrong. When it was finished, they walked out of the courthouse into an afternoon that had gone warm while they were inside. Genuinely warm. The kind of April afternoon that meant something was shifting for real. The mud was drying at the edges of the road. There was something green happening in the grass along the courthouse wall. Mara stood on the steps in the warm afternoon, and something happened to her face that she wasn't managing or directing. It just happened. The release of something that had been held for so long it had become structural, and she stood there and let it happen and didn't try to stop it. Silas stood beside her with Eli on his hip and let her have that without looking away. After a while, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at Eli, who looked back at her with grave and loving attention. "Hey, baby," she said, a little rough. "We're okay." Eli put his hand on her cheek. "Yeah," she said, we're okay." Nathan came out behind them and shook their hands and was businesslike about the next steps, which was exactly what you wanted from Nathan Crowley. And eventually he went back inside because there were filings, and Nathan Crowley was the kind of man who did not leave filings undone. And Victor Quinn was escorted from the courthouse by 2 men of the court, and put on his horse and turned down the road out of Harlan, and the last Silas saw of him was the back of a well-made coat going around the bend in the road at a controlled, deliberate pace. A man who would not let anyone see him broken, not even now. Silas watched until the road was empty. Then he shifted Eli on his hip, and the baby grabbed a fistful of his collar, and Mara stood beside him in the warm afternoon, and the three of them stood on the courthouse steps in Harlan as the light moved across the valley and the first real day of spring made its case for itself. The drive back from Harlan took 2 days, same as always, but it felt shorter. Not because anything about the road had changed. It was still rutted from mud season in the low sections, still steep where it climbed into the Callaway Range, still the kind of road that required attention and didn't reward distraction. It felt shorter because something in the wagon had changed. A pressure that had been present for so long it had become invisible had lifted, and without it the miles just moved differently. Mara sat straighter. She looked at the country they were passing through, the greening hillsides, the swollen creeks running clear and fast with snowmelt. In a way she hadn't looked at landscape since Silas had known her, which was to say she looked at it like someone who had the time to notice it was beautiful. Eli, for his part, was done with wagon travel entirely, and had decided to express this through a sustained campaign of vocal dissatisfaction that they managed in shifts, one of them driving while the other attempted to engage the baby in activities he found acceptable. His current position on the matter was that acceptable activities were limited, and the wagon was not one of them. He has opinions, Silas said for approximately the 100th time since January. He comes by it honestly, Mara said. They stopped the first night at the same way station as before, and the same woman was behind the counter, and she looked at them with the same assessing eye. But something was different this time, some quality in how Mara walked through the door, and the woman's look shifted from speculative to something more neutral, and she gave them 2 rooms without comment. After Eli was down, Mara knocked on Silas's door. He opened it, and she was standing in the hallway in her coat, which she'd put back on just to come 3 feet across the hall. "I can't sleep," she said. "Neither can I. Can we just sit somewhere without it being a thing?" "Yeah," he said. "There's a bench out front." They sat on the bench outside the way station in the dark, the mountain air still cool enough at night to need a coat, and the stars doing what stars did at elevation, which was show up in numbers that felt almost aggressive. There was a creek somewhere below the road that they could hear but not see. They sat for a while without talking, which had become a thing they were good at, the comfortable kind of not talking, where the silence wasn't a gap waiting to be filled, but just a place you could both exist without performing. Then Mara said, "You said you were going to ask me something. When it was over." He'd said that in the barn, 2 months ago. He'd said it, and then they'd both gone into the hardest stretch of everything, and neither of them had mentioned it. "I did say that," he said. "It's over now." He looked at the stars for a moment. He thought about how to do this correctly, and then he thought about how the whole story of the last several months had been about 2 people trying to do things correctly in the middle of a situation that had no clean options, and maybe the doing it correctly was less important than the doing it honestly. He turned to look at her. "I'm not a romantic man," he said. I don't have a speech prepared. I've been alone a long time, and I'm used to doing things by myself, and I'm not always going to know how to do it differently." He paused. "But I know that since January, this ranch has been more alive than it's been in 8 years. And I know that Eli reaches for me when I come in the room, and I know that I have not looked forward to anything in a very long time, and I look forward to coming home now." He met her eyes. "I want to marry you, when you're ready, if you ever are. I know what you've just been through, and I know that the word marriage probably has weight in it right now that I can't entirely account for. So I'm asking, and the answer can be whatever it needs to be, and it doesn't change anything about you staying." Mara Quinn sat on this bench outside the way station and looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "You don't need more time to—" "Silas." She looked at him with that directness she had that he'd never gotten used to. "I know my own mind. I've always known my own mind. The problem was never that I didn't know it. The problem was that I was married to a man who spent 4 years convincing me it didn't count." She paused. "Yes, that's my answer." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said back, and there was something in how they said it. The same word they'd exchanged 100 times. The word that had functioned between them as agreement and acknowledgement, and I'm still here all at once. That felt like the right note for it. Not flowers and declarations, just all right. Just two people who'd already proven they could stand next to each other in the difficult parts agreeing to keep doing that. The creek ran below them in the dark, and the stars were unreasonably bright, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else about it that night. They came back to the ranch on the third day in the warm yellow light of a late April afternoon, and it looked the same as it always did coming up the road from the south. The house first, then the barn, the lower pasture green and soft, the mountains behind it still carrying snow on the peaks, but showing rock now where the high slopes had been white all winter. Dalt Henner's note was on the table again. Cattle fine, west fence holding, spring coming early. He'd left a ham on the kitchen shelf, which was his way of being friendly without having to be present for it. Silas fed the animals and checked the fences. The east section was whole, untouched, which felt significant. And when he came back in, Mara had already lit the stove and put water on and was sitting on the kitchen floor, letting Eli practice walking along the length of the lower cabinet doors, holding his arms out at the ready for the inevitable moment of miscalculation. Eli made 3 steps, then 4, then sat down with an expression of philosophical acceptance. 5 tomorrow, Mara said. 5 today if you count the last one, Silas said. The last one was a controlled fall. It was very controlled. Eli looked up at both of them with the dignity of someone who found this commentary unnecessary and pulled himself back up against the cabinet door. The spring came in earnest then, the way spring came in the mountains. Not gently, not gradually, but in a rush, as though the season had been waiting behind a door and someone had finally opened it. The upper pastures greened. The garden beds Mara had started in March exploded into something real. Onions, lettuce, the early cold tolerant things rose so straight they still delighted him every time he looked at them. She'd been seed saving from the kitchen stores all winter, and she planted more than he'd expected, pushing the garden out past its original boundary into a section of yard that had been nothing but weeds for years. "You're taking over," he said, looking at the expanded rows. "I told you I don't take up much space," she said, not looking up from the seedlings she was thinning. "You said that in January. I've been watching you take up more space every week since then." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "It's an observation." She turned back to the seedlings with something on her face that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same territory. He stood there watching her work for a moment. The practical efficiency of her hands, the way she moved through the garden like she'd had it for years already. And he thought about what it was to watch a person become themselves in a place. He'd seen it with the shooting in February, the day she'd hit 3 cans in a row, and he'd watched something settle in her spine. He'd seen it when Nathan read the dissolution of the marriage in that courtroom, and she'd exhaled once, quietly, like a door closing on a room she'd never have to go back into. He was watching it now, in the garden, in the way she took up space without apology. People became themselves in the presence of safety. That was what he'd learned from all of this. Not the dramatic courtroom version of the lesson, but the daily one. The lesson that showed up in kitchen routines and garden rows and a baby learning to walk along cabinet doors. Safety was the condition under which a person could finally show you who they actually were, and what he was seeing, now that Mara Quinn had it, was someone who was considerably more than she'd been allowed to be. He'd have told you that in January if you'd asked him to look closely enough. He hadn't been looking closely enough in January. He was looking now. Nathan wrote in May to say that Victor Quinn had been contacted by the Territory Marshal's office regarding the information in Mara's deposition. The names on that piece of paper. The connections Nathan's contact had been quietly investigating since February. It was not a full accounting. Men like Victor rarely faced a full accounting, and Nathan was honest enough to say so without wrapping it in false comfort. But the Marshal's interest meant Victor was no longer able to move freely in at least 3 counties. And the men he'd been connected to had their own reasons not to want that kind of scrutiny, which meant Victor's usefulness to that network was finished, which meant Victor was on his own in the way that men who'd relied on dangerous alliances found themselves alone when those alliances dissolved. "He's contained," Nathan wrote, which was lawyerly language for "he's not coming back." Mara read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then put it in the drawer with the other documents, the ones she'd carried sewn into Eli's blanket all the way from Seaton, and she closed the drawer. "Okay," she said. "Just that." Okay. Silas understood that she wasn't celebrating, and he understood why. Containment wasn't justice. A man like Victor Quinn not coming back wasn't the same as a man like Victor Quinn having faced what he'd actually done. There were years of her life in that drawer, and the law had done what it could with them, which was not the same as undoing them. She knew the difference, and she wasn't going to pretend she didn't. But she'd closed the drawer. And she'd said, okay. That was its own kind of progress. The wedding was in June, on a Saturday that arrived with the specific arrogance of a mountain summer day that knew it was beautiful. Clear sky, warm enough for sleeves, the wildflowers on the south slope doing something complicated and purple that Mara said she didn't know the name of but intended to find out. They didn't go to town for it. Silas had asked, and Mara had said she'd rather it be here, at the ranch, which was where everything that mattered had already happened. Dalt Henner came because Silas asked him, and because Dalt, under the exterior of a man who operated on a strict minimum of social interaction, was actually reasonably fond of Silas in the way that neighbors who'd known each other 20 years developed a fondness that was mostly expressed through practical assistance and occasionally a ham. Nathan Crowley drove up from Harlan, which was a 2-day round trip he undertook without complaint, and which said everything that needed to be said about the kind of man Nathan was. Helen Quinn came. She'd been writing to Mara since the courthouse. Careful letters, not presumptuous, not asking for more than Mara was willing to give, but present. Mara had written back. The correspondence had the quality of two people building something from the foundation up, slowly and without a blueprint, because no blueprint existed for what they were trying to build. Helen arrived at the ranch the evening before looking like a woman who wasn't sure she deserved to be there and was coming anyway, and Mara met her at the gate, and that was enough. A justice of the peace from the town of Millard Creek, the same town that was 10 miles from the ranch, the same 10 miles Mara had walked in January through the worst storm of the year, came up the mountain road on a roan horse and performed the ceremony under the open sky beside the ranch house, with the mountains at their backs and the wildflowers doing their thing on the slope, and Eli sitting on Helen's knee in the front row of the small assembly, wearing an expression of great ceremony that may or may not have been intentional. Silas stood in front of the justice of the peace and felt the particular weight of the moment, not heavy in the bad way, just substantial, the way important things had substance that ordinary things didn't. He'd done this before, in a different life, and he was aware of that without being crushed by it. Eleanor was part of what had made him who he was standing here, and who he was standing here was a man who had opened a door in a blizzard and been changed by what he found on the other side, and both of those things were true at the same time, and that was all right. He looked at Mara. She was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, deep blue, the kind of dress a woman kept for good occasions, which told him she'd had it since before and had carried it through all of it, through all the running and the hiding and the sleeping in a strange ranch house in January, and had kept it because she'd believed, some stubbornly optimistic part of her had believed, even then, that there would be an occasion for it eventually. She looked at him with her direct, serious eyes. The justice of the peace said the words that were said on these occasions, and they gave their answers. And when it was done, Silas took her hands and held them, and he said quiet enough that it was just between them. The barn still needs the roof patched on the east side. She looked at him. I'm aware, she said, and the north fence is going to need reworking before winter. Silas? I'm just saying, I know it's not perfect, she said. I know what I signed up for. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. I think you do. She squeezed his hands once and then let go, and they turned back to the small gathering of people who'd come up a mountain road to stand in a field and watch this happen, and Dalt Henner was looking at the middle distance with the studied indifference of a man who was not going to acknowledge being moved by anything. And Nathan was writing something in a small notebook, which was the most Nathan thing possible. And Helen Quinn had Eli on her knee, and her eyes were doing what eyes did, and she wasn't trying to stop them, and Eli was looking at Silas with the absolute attention he gave everything and reaching one hand toward him across Helen's lap. Silas went and took him. Eli grabbed his collar with both fists and settled against his chest with the finality of someone who had found the location he preferred and was not planning to leave it. They ate outside, which meant improvised furniture, and everyone sitting slightly wrong, and the wildflower slope visible the whole time, and the mountain light going gold and long as the afternoon moved toward evening. Dalt ate 2 plates and said 16 words, and that was fine. Nathan told a story about a case from 10 years ago that illustrated something about courts and human nature that everyone found interesting. Helen sat next to Mara, and they talked in the low voices of people covering ground slowly, but covering it. And Mara laughed once, really laughed, the kind that surprised her, at something Helen said, and Silas noted that without making anything of it. After, when the guests had settled into the quiet of a summer evening, Silas walked out to the east fence line. The section that had been cut 3 times in February, that he'd repaired 3 times, that had been whole and untouched since the hearing. He stood at the fence in the long evening light and looked out at the mountains and at the pasture and at the ranch behind him, the lights coming on in the windows, the smoke rising from the kitchen stove where someone was making coffee. He stood there for a while. He was not a man who thought in terms of before and after. Generally, ranch life didn't allow for that kind of sorting. Things just proceeded, and you proceeded with them. But standing at that fence in the evening, he allowed himself the before and after just this once, the 8 years of before. The January night, that was the line between them. The after, which was still early and still imperfect and still had a roof that needed patching on the east side of the barn. He thought about Eleanor. He let himself do that without flinching from it and without feeling like it was a betrayal of anything. Eleanor had been real, and her death had been real, and the 8 years after it had been real. The silence and the grief and the slow, grinding work of becoming a person who could function inside a loss that big. All of that was real, and it had made him who he was, and he wasn't going to apologize for any of it or pretend the shape of it wasn't still somewhere in him. But he was also 50 feet from a house that had people in it now, people who would be there tomorrow, who would be there next winter when the storms came off the mountain, who would fill the rooms with the sounds that rooms needed to have. A baby pulling himself along the furniture, someone working in the kitchen, the particular weight of another person's presence in the dark hours when the mountain was quiet. He was not going to waste that on grief that had already done what grief was supposed to do. He went back inside. It was October when Mara told him. The garden had been put to bed for the year, the last of the squash harvested, the beds mulched against the coming cold, the seeds she'd saved drying in paper envelopes labeled in her small, precise handwriting. Eli was walking now, fully and with conviction, which had introduced an entirely new geography of concern to the ranch house. Because Eli's opinion of what constituted an accessible location for a 14-month-old was considerably broader than anyone else's. He had also developed a word, which was not mama or any of the expected ones, but was instead a sound he deployed specifically at Silas, a 2-syllable sound that had started as approximation and sharpened over weeks into something that was recognizably, unmistakably Dada. And the first time Silas had understood what the baby was saying to him, he had needed to go check something in the barn for about 10 minutes. Mara had not commented on this. She'd just watched it happen with the expression she had when she was feeling something large and was keeping it appropriately sized. She found him in the barn that October evening, same as she'd found him in February when she'd told him the rest of the story, same doorway and same lamplight, and he looked up from what he was doing and saw her face. "What's wrong?" he said. "Nothing's wrong," she said. And then, "I'm pregnant." He set down what he was holding. The lamp threw its light across the barn, and outside the October dark was early and complete, the stars just starting to show, and from the house he could faintly hear Eli doing something that involved both movement and commentary. He looked at her. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about the winter she'd died, the child they'd lost before it had a chance to be anything except the most devastating absence of his life. He thought about how he'd carried that for 8 years like carrying weather inside your coat, present always, pressing on everything. He thought about all of that, and then he looked at Mara standing in the barn doorway, and he crossed the barn in 4 steps and put his arms around her, and she stood inside that and exhaled slowly against his shoulder. "Are you all right?" she said, against his coat. She was asking about Eleanor in the way she always asked about the things she didn't ask about directly. "Yeah," he said, and he meant it. Not the performing kind of yeah, not the managing kind, the actual kind. "Yeah, I am." She pulled back enough to look at his face, checking, because she'd learned to check. Whatever she saw satisfied her. "Okay," she said. Same word she'd used in May, same word she used for the things that had been hard and were now settled. "Okay." He held her for a while in the barn while the horses were calm in their stalls, and the lamp burned, and outside the October night came down over the Callaway Range the way it did every year, cold and clear and full of stars that would be there in November and December and in January when the first big storm came off the mountain and the drifts piled against the fence and the road from Millard Creek became impossible for days at a time. He thought about January. He thought about what it took to walk 10 miles in that, through the dark and the drifts and the cutting wind, carrying a baby, with nowhere certain at the end of it. He thought about what kind of fear could drive a person to do that, and what kind of courage lived right next to that fear, close enough that sometimes you couldn't see the seam between them. He thought about what it meant that she'd knocked on his door. Not on someone else's door, not on the door of someone she knew or a place she was certain of, but on a stranger's door on a mountain at the edge of everything, because it was the only door there was. He thought about the fact that he'd opened it. People asked him later, in the years that followed, how he'd known, how he'd let her stay, how he'd known she was worth the trouble, worth the men who came after, worth the courtrooms and the long winter of being watched from the tree line and all the rest of it. He never had a clean answer for that. He just said he hadn't known. He'd just opened the door. That was the whole of it, really. Not wisdom and not foresight and nothing romantic about it in the moment, just a man opening a door in a blizzard because there was a person on the other side of it who needed it opened. The rest was just what happened after. Their daughter was born the following June in the room at the back of the ranch house where Mara had slept that first week in January, 15 months before. The room had changed. Curtains now, a proper quilt on the bed, drawings that Eli had produced during the phase when he believed all surfaces were appropriate canvases, tacked to the wall at a height that gave you a sense of his stature at the time. The wood stove had been relined and drew properly now. The frost that had patterned the glass that first night had been sealed out by a morning in March when Silas had replaced the window framing and Mara had held the pieces while he worked, and they'd argued pleasantly about the correct way to do it. The baby was healthy and loud and had, from her first hour, the specific quality of someone who was going to have opinions about things. Eli, summoned to meet her, stood beside the bed with the gravity he'd never entirely shed, looking at his sister with the same evaluating expression he'd once turned on Silas across a breakfast table. Then he put out one careful finger and touched her hand, and she grabbed it with the grip that all babies had, the instinctive, total grip, and Eli looked up at Mara with enormous eyes. "She's strong," he said, which was almost 3 now, and this was a complete sentence, and Mara's face did several things at once. "She is," Mara said. "She comes by it honestly." Silas sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter and his wife and his son standing with his finger captured in a grip he couldn't break. And outside, through the newly repaired window, the June mountain was doing what it did in June, green and extravagant and loud with birds. And he sat inside all of it and let it be what it was. He didn't think about what he deserved. He didn't think about whether this was earned or whether the grief of before entitled him to the good of now, because that wasn't how any of it worked, and he'd lived long enough to know it. Good things didn't come as compensation. They came because you opened the door, and because you didn't close it again when it got hard, and because the person on the other side of it was braver than the storm that was trying to stop her. That was the only equation he could make of it that felt true. Mara looked at him over the baby's head. "The east fence is going to need work before winter," she said. He laughed. "The real kind. The one that still came out slightly rusty even now, even after months of having reasons to use it." And she smiled at him with all the complication she'd always had in her smile. The layers of everything she'd been through and everything she'd kept and everything she'd set down. And none of it was resolved or erased or made clean, and the ranch still had the barn roof and the north fence and 10,000 practical things that needed doing, and none of that was different. But they were going to do it together. And every winter after, when the first big storm came down off the Callaway Range and the snow piled against the windows, and the road disappeared and the world contracted to just the house and the barn and the animals and the people inside the walls, Mara would stand at the east-facing window sometimes and look out at the mountain dark and the driving snow, and she would think about January, about the specific weight of Eli against her chest and the specific cruelty of the wind and the specific darkness of a mountain road with nowhere certain at the end of it. She didn't think about it with grief. She thought about it the way you thought about something that had asked everything of you and that you had answered correctly. She had walked through the worst night of her life toward a door she had no reason to believe would open. It had opened. That was the thing about doors, she'd decided. You couldn't know. You knocked and you waited, and sometimes the person on the other side was the wrong person, and the door opened onto something worse than the storm. But sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes, it opened onto a man with a lamp who stepped back and said, "Get inside," and meant it. You couldn't know in advance which one it was going to be. You knocked anyway. That was what courage actually was, she'd decided. Not the absence of fear. Not the dramatic version of it, the version that knew it was being brave. Just the knocking. Just the willingness to stand in the dark and lift your hand and believe, without evidence, that something on the other side might be worth it. She had knocked. He had opened the door. And the storm, which had been so certain it would win, had just been weather after all. End.